In 1982, Neil Ziegler, the producer of the BBC's respected Play for Today strand, had noted the popularity of the time travel episode The Flip Side of Dominic Hyde and its sequel. It encouraged him to create an experimental spin-off called Play for Tomorrow. 6 episodes were made and broadcast in the same time slot as its parent show. 6 writers were briefed by a panel of experts about what the beginning of the 21st century might hold for Britain, and then were asked to write a TV play. Today we're talking about Bright Eyes. Hello and welcome back to Very British Futures, the podcast about UK science fiction television. And at the moment we're in a special mini-season examining Play for Tomorrow, the 1982 anthology of 6 speculative plays about what life in Britain would be like at the dawn of the 21st century. Today, joining me in a futuristic prison visiting room is John Arnold, writer and co-host of the Strangers in Space podcast. Hello, how are you?
I'm not bad at all, thank you very much. How are you?
Not too bad. Looking forward to this. Thanks for sparing some time.
Oh, my pleasure.
Bright Eyes was written by Peter Prince and directed by Peter Duffel. It was broadcast on BBC One Tuesday the 20th of April at 9:15 p.m. Both men had previously worked on Play for Today. It starred Robin Ellis, Sarah Berger and Stephen Greif. New Year's Eve, 1999. Great Britain is part of the European state. The Euro army is in the midst of a controversial war in the Middle East. Rich businessman Sam Howard has come to a French prison to see his daughter Cathy, who has been arrested for being part of a conspiracy to assassinate a pro-war politician and is facing execution. The authorities hope he can persuade her to issue an apology, regretting her actions, allowing them to commute her sentence to prison time. Waiting outside her cell, Sam's memory flashes back to 2 earlier New Year Eves, 1979 when she was 6 years old and left with him overnight by his ex-wife, 1989 when she was 16 and he criticised her 60s-themed party as disrespectful to the genuine struggles of that decade. When she said she didn't care about politics, he told her to start taking an interest and challenged the official line about the coming war. Now a crowd of journalists wait outside the prison, and his wife and her legal team are helpless. He must decide whether to ask her to betray her principles to save her life. Well, had you heard about this before I got in touch with you?
I knew about the Strand and roughly what it was about, but I hadn't actually seen the plays because they're not currently available. So I hadn't gone out hunting them down yet. I think the only one I was kind of half familiar with was Cricket, because it was kind of confidence of my interests. And I really do love the eccentricity of that one. So I was really interested to visit the other ones in the Strand. So this one was a really good start.
Oh, cool stuff. So what was your overall impression of Bright Eyes?
I liked it. I think as much as most of these futures, it tells you a lot about the vision of the future at the time it was written, how they're anticipating things going. Really nicely structured as well. I think it's almost trying to avoid writing science fiction. Yeah, it's a non-science fiction play in a lot of ways. It's just a kind of a little veneer on that at the end. Just a different kind of vision of what the political reality would be like. But yeah, overall, I really liked it. I thought it was a nice, strong play, with plenty to say about the time it was written, and plenty to say about the anxieties of that time as well.
I certainly agree with you. It's the least science fiction-y of the six. It really, the only science fiction component is this kind of greater Euro state that Britain is a part of. And perhaps, we'll move on to we'll talk about the set a little later on and the little sort of trappings of it. Like a lot of these plays in this anthology, it's a very theatrical piece. It's sort of, it wouldn't take too much, I don't think, to translate it to the stage, really. It's largely based in one set.
Yeah, it's kind of really a two-hander across three scenes, isn't it?
Different ways. I think, yeah, it's an interesting story about ideas. One theme I've picked up watching these six plays is how much the bomb is usually in the background in one way or another. But this is the exceptional one, because ironically, because it's more about a conventional war instead.
Yeah.
So there's not actually any kind of real mention of a nuclear threat in this one.
No, a kind of nuclear threat might undermine it a little because you need that pro-war, because it's a war in the Middle East, isn't it? So a kind of a nuclear war might undermine that a little.
It would, yeah. I think if it were a nuclear war, it would be a case that everybody would have other priorities
Absolutely.
to be worrying about.
He's not interested. I mean, the only thing I could say about the anxiety today at that point would be it's maybe anti-European Union in a lot of ways. It's seeing that, and that developing into a European army, which I think might have been an anxiety of the left at the time, but certainly at the time it was more kind of a Tony Benn kind of issue rather than a conservative one. And there were, I think, either in the late 90s or 2000s, whispers of a kind of a European Union peacekeeping force or army, but that never came to pass. So I think it slightly has that slight British misinterpretation of the European Union, because the European Union's more this kind of administrative talking shop, which prevented those kind of wars on the continent. It's settling the problems without them getting to a hot button issue.
That's a good take on it, I think. It's certainly not a sort of Brexity, oh no, it's all gone terribly wrong since we've become closer to Europe. Politically, in many ways, the issues are the same politics we've got now, and as of then, it's more, as you say, it's more the West and the Middle East that is the background to it, rather than any worries about British culture being subsumed or British. Well, we don't really find out much about British authority in this one.
No, it's more about the generational tensions, isn't it, rather than the political ones.
So, in fact, that probably is the biggest theme of it. It's the difference between the generations. I think this is an ongoing debate. I think a lot of generations kind of look back and complain that the youth are all feckless and not interested in big issues.
Absolutely. I think it comes from generation to generation, doesn't it? Because you can see it with all the memes on Facebook with the old, in our day it was like this. Do you remember Spangles? All that kind of nostalgic stuff.
I think nowadays it's more that everyone's too sensitive these days.
Absolutely.
Or looking at their screens too much. But back when this play was written, I think there was a feeling amongst baby boomers who sort of like had their youth in the 60s. I think there was a feeling of today's young people were too materialistic.
There is that. There's Norman Tebbit thing, because I remember he was particularly vocal against the 60s. It was permissiveness and moral decadence. So it was, again, I think this has the question of whether you engage with that kind of past as it was, or if you fetishize it. And you can see it very much certainly in the middle section being fetishized.
Definitely. I think it still is fetishized to some extent. You can understand someone who's grown up in it. Well, I'm saying I can understand. Do you ever feel, I mean, we're sort of children of the 80s.
Yes.
Did you say?
Yeah.
I was just speaking personally, I don't feel a great indignation about when the 80s. I mean, we're now getting period drama that, in a way, that's set in the 80s. Generally, it doesn't make me feel indignant or that they've got it wrong. I don't know about yourself.
No, because but they're all. I suppose it's engaging with all the issues that were obvious, and certainly you can make a case politically. There's some certain fetishization of the 80s, particularly on the last government. They were kind of buying into that Margaret Thatcher legend that she built up in the 90s, rather than why did she do this? How did she get there? These were the results. If we just apply these, then it'll be fine. But I thought that kind of 60s party, I think it's quite clever, because there's a book called Retromania by Simon Reynolds, which is about the impulse to look backwards and where it came from. I think he said it started pretty much when money making people realised that you could sell the past to 50s teenagers nostalgic when they grew up in the 70s. So it's been on that cycle ever since. And I thought that kind of 90s appropriation of the 60s ends up being quite prescient. Because there was that kind of outbreak of 60s imagery, fetishization of 60s music and culture in that mid-90s period.
There certainly was the whole sort of Britpop and certain films like Get Carter and The Italian Job.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of, which, yes, as you say, suddenly became very trendy again. There was the whole post-feminist. There was a complaint that a lot of women didn't appreciate what people had been through in the 60s. And they were now, some people's opinion was that, if anything, women's were sort of like regressing backwards to a more concentrating on being lovely and fragrant and feminine, sort of like, rather than sort of worrying about politics.
Yeah, it's that kind of ironic period in the 90s, isn't it? Into the 2000s, where the Ladettes, or just the loaded culture as well, where women were there to look at. They weren't there to hold high political office or be appreciated for their skills rather than for their looks. Yeah, that wasn't a great period looking back at that. I don't think it's a bit at the time.
So at the moment, this the story of Bright Eyes, and it's about extremism as well. It's about how far you go for your political principles. And my word, we are living in a time when some people are turning to violence in order for their political ideals very easily.
Absolutely, and this is another 60s thing, because in the youth of the 60s when they radicalised, I think it's the first real kind of political, the hippie movement, the anti-war movements in the US against Vietnam, the 1968 in France, the riots over there, in Paris, and also you get political violence like the Red Brigade, the Red Army faction, Baader Meinhof, that kind of thing. And that's the kind of youth of the 60s of having been radicalised. And that does ask the question about history repeating itself in the 90s with this part.
Back in the 60s, it was quite frightening, I think, to people of the time. It was as violent and frightening as recent events have been for us. And then it gets softened and romanticised into more, it's all about freedom and fighting the man.
Peace and love.
That's it. And Sam, to some extent, is a good example of that. In that middle section where he's sort of like criticising her 60s party, and it's very interesting. He tells that little story about how his uncle Julius had picked them up after a protest and had brought them and was taking them home. He does this big passionate speech about, well, at least they're standing for something and they're fighting for their principles, and then he follows it by, well, that's what I was going to say. But he was a very frightening man, was Julius.
Yeah, organised in a car plant, wasn't it? Detroit or something like that. Yeah, so it's the lovely thing is the question she asks him at the end of that scene. It's like, but essentially you decided you were going to go off and make money instead. Yes.
Yes, there is an element of it's a wish fulfillment. So he has this kind of romantic, the path not travelled. He can look at it in comfort. I mean, that's another theme of the play. It's the installation of money, this rich family. She's, as she says, it won't be people like us who join the army.
Yes, it's a privilege, isn't it? Again, another theme very, very relevant to today. We essentially get money tends to buy you a nice, easy road through.
It does. So, to some extent, she is... Well, at that point, she's naive in one way because she doesn't. She says herself she doesn't really care about politics. Do you think she's as naive in a way in the present day when we get to 1999?
I think that's really nicely put. Yeah, she is. She's almost swung from one extreme to another. She's kind of naive. She doesn't know politics, and obviously these chats on New Year's Eve that we see are important, are vital to the way she kind of thinks. So she's actually taken on board what Sam said, and she's acted on that. She's going ahead. She's found a cause. She found a cause she believes in. And again, an anti-war cause, that's not a cause that anyone can really argue with, I don't think.
Yeah, I've got to say, the basic principle of being against the war, that's something nobody can argue against. It's just where you go from there, really, because there's, even in any current war, every side says, well, we want peace, but then how they define peace will be very different depending on which side you're on.
Exactly. And I think that's, again, a strength of the writing is that it gives her a moral justification to, behind her actions. And she hasn't actually pulled the trigger herself in this. She just does justify this herself. She's only brought the weapons over. And the lovely thing is you can say, well, surely that makes you complicit, because if you've taken the weapons, they're going to be used. But equally, her hands aren't dirty.
Yeah, it's interesting in a way that we don't, but it's quite ambiguous in some ways. We never find out how much she was involved. I mean, there's one way it could be that she got in over her head, and now she's kind of retrospectively justifying it, and in a way going hard. I don't know if that's quite the right phrase or not, and saying, I don't regret any of it, and I'm sort of like ready to die. Earlier on, that wasn't her intention. In a way, it's kind of got out of hand.
Not at all. And there's the thing they say where she could be pulled in by a boyfriend or a partner or just a charismatic figure. We don't ever quite see that, whether she's genuinely acted of her own volition and found her people, gone with that, or if she's been Stockholm syndrome.
Yes, there's an element of Patty Hearst about it.
American heiress who was kidnapped and ended up sympathising with her kidnappers.
So, and of course that would have been much more fresher in people's minds.
Absolutely.
Back in 1982. And moving on to thinking about the performances of it, how do you feel about the lead, Sam?
Robin Ellis.
Robin Ellis.
Poldark fame, wasn't it? I really like it because it's not necessarily the easiest lead performance, because you have to change over the decades, but also it's kind of a slightly bewildered lead, particularly in the future scenes. Because again, it's a man who's moving out of time. I think it'll come to us all, because I can even see it. I'm not that old, but I can still see. I don't necessarily know what my son's generation are going through, say, or what generation just above him. I don't know their problems at their everyday, because I don't live it. So you don't quite have the same experiences. You don't quite have that lingua franca, that common language. It's really nice that you can see this over time. And you can even see it developing from that first scene, where he's almost too busy to go and read her a bedtime story or look after anything. Just, I'll stay outside the door and listen to you. And you can see that this connection develop.
And it's interesting how he develops, as a parent, because that is another part of I think the good storytelling by Peter Prince, and that a lot of things aren't said out loud. It's lovely. There's a lot of stuff that is definitely shown rather than told, and that includes her relationship with her parents, which I think is very nicely done.
Absolutely. You never quite learn why she doesn't talk to her mother as much. And that's lovely because it's so subject. I love it because it always lets the viewer into the play, I think.
It might be possible that she had to be more the disciplinarian, and Sam was more the kind of fun dad, dropping in from time to time. But,
or she just didn't like her stepdad.
That is quite possible. He does come across as... It's interesting contrast, whereas, as you say, Sam is quite bewildered. He's sort of... He comes across as, in some ways, a reasonable man. He's trying to be a good man, but this is all like completely out of his... this is a whole new world to him that he's having to navigate. And he's quite vulnerable, reasonable to some extent with people, whereas his wife's new husband, John, he's much more bullish, and I think he's just as bewildered as Sam, but he sort of covers it up, trying to be sort of take charge.
Trying to be strong, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a real contrast of character. And it's quite nice to get that between the old husband and the new husband, because you understand maybe why she wanted a different relationship. However that developed. That kind of performance is so well written, and again, I said Ellis plays it well. At the start, it's deliberately kind of reflecting how confused he is by this world as well. How kind of he feels a little out of time, because that future world is slightly disorienting, because obviously we get the foreign language, we get those sounds, and it's just lovely because he doesn't quite know how to deal with it. But he does try. He talks to the guard whose first language is French. He ends up votre superior. He knows just enough to try, but not enough to actually take command of the situation. And he's never going to take charge of it. And you can see that in the performance.
It is a nice performance. It's nice. There's a lot of subtlety in it. I mean, that's probably one of the things that most ultimately turns Kathy round, is seeing her father so upset and distressed in that when they do meet.
Yeah, again, it's great writing because it lets the actors sell that. Again, you get that the moment of crisis where they're talking about, and they're at the 60s party. You can see where he got worked up about the 60s, about the causes. You can see that, and then you can see her in the interview room as well. That he's obviously come all this way to look out for her, to try and persuade her, essentially to compromise her principles.
And he feels the conflict there, I think, more than her mother does. I think he understands a bit more what compromising means in this case.
I know. And I think with the way we've had that scene flashback, he feels a little responsible for her being there as well, in a way her mother doesn't, and I don't think her mother could understand.
It would be too much to say there's like a direct line between the conversation they have in New Year's 89 to where we get to in 1999. Yes. But obviously, we all kind of slightly big up our parts, I think, in other people's lives. And he's a good example of that. He sort of takes responsibility.
Yes, it's from his own perspective, isn't it? So he feels at least that he planted the seeds.
Just moving over to with Sarah Berger as Kathy, who's what do you think? Well, I think she's got quite a difficult part to play, and she's got to do this aging up between this 16-year-old party girl and then this terrorist
or complicit. Yeah, it's almost two different parts, isn't it? Because it's the unformed person, again, who's young, and maybe you do treat the past as a bit of a joke. You're not necessarily respectful to it. Those, when they're chanting about Ho Chi Minh and hey hey LBJ, and they're taking the iconography of the past. They're playing with that, and that's what's exciting about it, not the substance of it.
I think definitely. I think you see a lot of examples of that on social media of people, using symbols and phrases and stuff without really appreciating the meaning behind them.
Yeah, it's chaos, and it's in that way it's a really well written kind of thing for the youth of that day to be using those symbols and just carelessly, just without considering anything about what they're saying. And then she has to shift to a kind of a colder, harder performance. And I think she does that really nicely. Someone who's gone from, they literally don't know anything about the world to get involved, to absolutely found a cause and committed to it.
I think it is a good performance. I think she's got all this kind of righteous anger and seemingly assured, at least when we first meet her in the cell. But you can see in the eyes there's definitely a fear there.
Yeah.
And she's on this roller coaster.
She's confused by the world. Maybe that's where you can see part of the kind of bomb anxiety in it, that war anxiety of the consequences of war. Part of it is driven by fear. When you're young, I think you can always go, the world is wrong, and you can go off in a direction without actually understanding why the world's wrong. And I think this is what it's implying that she's doing. The cause is fine, but she's almost like thinking there's a simple solution, that if you get rid of your opponents, that then you get rid of the cause. And a bit older, you realise, no, that's absolutely not happening at all. So she's kind of found that wrong course. But I love the way that it's not played for sympathy at all by Sarah Burge. It's played as someone who believes in that cause. So that gives those scenes between her and Robin Ellis a genuine kind of power to them, because it's like any good drama. Both sides are right. And the good thing is, this is never didactic enough to say which side is the right of the argument.
Definitely, yeah. It's in fact, watching it a second time, I've come to appreciate that more. I think the first time I watched it, I was a little bit, I wish he'd kind of come to more of a conclusion one way or another. And this time, I think keeping it ambiguous it makes it a much stronger piece. I mean, it leaves him at the end. It's sort of like he seems to have saved his daughter's life, but has he put her into other kind of trouble? This is certainly not the end of the story, as her defense lawyer points out to him.
Yeah. You haven't even got a deal. Isn't that nice? Which makes that kind of point where they finish the actual song Bright Eyes over the credits, the Into the Dark is the last line. It's a really beautifully unsettling kind of moment.
He gives him that statement, that retraction, and Shapiro says, yes, this is a good start.
Yeah.
So there's a sense, yes, whether she's going to be interrogated more or they want to exploit her for propaganda purposes more, we don't know.
Oh, and that's another lovely thing about it, is that kind of manipulation by media. The media wants that story, and it's prepared to push the people involved to get it. And I think these are kind of the early days of Rupert Murdoch. I think he had The Sun by this point. So it's the early days of that tabloid culture. Quite precise in the way it's looking forward on that front.
It is quite prescient in that sort of, media. They do like to come up with a story and then fit people into it.
Yes, they have their angle, haven't they?
Reporter who comes up. She's actually the only person who seems to be wearing anything like a futuristic costume. And it's probably just a fashion thing. Everybody else is in very conventional suits or similar. And she's the one who's kind of got this kind of slightly futuristic sort of trouser suit on.
I kind of wonder if it's they want it to kind of like the television. Maybe it's supposed to a style. They have to be absolutely up to the minute, whereas everyone else isn't particularly concerned with that. They're officials, so they're obviously in a uniform. Yeah,
it's a nice little part. I mean, we've been saying about the subtlety of Richardson. I mean, the reporter part, she's played by Della Finch, she's more a stereotype to some extent. She's
yes
in it, but there you are. Not some people have to be. I think in when you've got an hour, you've got to sometimes.
It's what the play needs, isn't it? Really?
To do that and build that in. And having spoken to Shapiro, that is a nice little. Again, he is kind of a type, played by Stephen Greif. Now it's always good to see him, and he's kind of, although he's the President Commissioner, he's that kind of local chief of police kind of character who always turns up in a lot of ITC dramas. He's sort of sophisticated and charming, but he's got a bit of an agenda of his own as well.
There's a bit of steel there, isn't there? And it's perfect for Stephen. I think that role.
He is. He's very good at that kind of role. I do like his. I quite like his idea. Actually, this is a nice little bit of world building. He talks about they're deciding which TV reporter should come up and interview him, and he says, "Why not Channel 14? I like the English sense of humour."
Yes,
which might give us a hint that maybe the BBC is no more. And now it's on Channel 14 in sort of like a Euro TV.
Yeah, and again, that kind of little, to go slightly off the top, that world building is, again, subtle. It's you have that soap opera at the start, and it's a global soap opera. And the number of viewers, it's more than there is in Britain. So there is that very international kind of flavour to this. The future is out there. It's international. It's not on our one little island.
Turning away from a bit about the production, what do you think of the look of it?
The way this has an advantage is that so much of it is set either in the past or in a near future, which doesn't need too much change. So it's visibly of its time. That kind of future that they have is that kind of antiseptic, almost that antiseptic waiting room. But you would really expect that of an official building, because that's all we see of that future. We don't see much outside. No,
we don't. So there is an advantage that it's such a limited set. It slightly reminded me of Blake 7. Somehow I could just sort of imagine some Federation officials striding about that waiting room, and it's got these big sliding doors that kind of open up at the top of these stairs, which is for some reason that kind of made me think a bit of Blake 7.
Kind of like that city in the way back in the start with Blake in it. I think it's very much that mildly extrapolated, but not too far. And then the future in '89 again. It's a normal domestic house, and the only kind of sign you've got there is the kids treating that '60s as this thing that's way, way in the past. It was never going to have the biggest budgets, but it encouraged you to think about how you make it without having a Star Wars sized budget behind you.
Yeah.
And the thing is, this is kind of the early '80s where you're getting the future's kind of decaying around us, because you're getting that Star Wars Dark Star, that kind of start in it. And then Blade Runner is around this time. I can't remember if it's the same year.
Blade Runner, yeah, it is this year.
82, yeah.
It is.
And the Aliens, and you think, it's imagining that lived-in future.
I think if this film, certainly, I think if this series had been made a couple of years later, Blade Runner would be the aesthetic, I think, because it just so took over 80s science fiction. There's a definite, you start off with Star Wars and stuff, and we're still kind of in that kind of Star Trek-y white, lots of kind of disco-y kind of look to it.
Lots of space.
Yeah, lots of space. Then Blade Runner comes along and just everything suddenly is dark, neon cities and grime.
Yeah, you'd seen this being, I don't know, say a job centre waiting room from any British town, that kind of haven't got the money to have the upkeep, so it'll all be, again, lived in, it'd be rotting, maybe, there'd be peeling wallpaper or something. Just that kind of slight shabbiness to it.
Well, I think we've covered a lot. I mean, is there anything we've not talked about that you wanted to bring up about Bright Eyes?
I think it's the use of Bright Eyes, isn't it? It's the way it changes over time on that. Because it's, back then, it's a child song. And I think you're obviously being so, you'll remember the film being this kind of, it's appropriate because it's kind of traumatic thing for kids. It's the world is a nice place when you're a vulnerable person trying to get across. And it's, they must have forked out a fair bit to get to be able to use the song, not the performance, but the performance rights on it. I know the BBC get it cheaply, but but they might not have granted permission. And, it's this kind of cute thing, but it's still unsettling when she sings it as a child, because it's just from a story that has a lot of sharp edges, has a lot of brutality in it. And it's so gorgeous. Again, I allude to it, but it's gorgeous the way it's then used over the opening credits, and it leaves at perhaps the darkest point of the song, literally into the dark.
It is a brilliant song, still be very much in people's consciousness in 82. And it's this beautiful song about death, and it's being sung by this 6-year-old. It's that contrast.
The 6-year-old being full of life and imagery is, as we think of it, the child being full of life and potential, and then the song absolutely opposite. It's about the creeping darkness creeping in. And I find it hard to believe that this wasn't on the writer's mind at this point.
Definitely, Peter Prince. Yes, I was looking up, but he seems to have mostly written TV plays and TV movies rather than series. He seems to have more done one-shot stories.
There was a career you could make in those days, wasn't it, on the play, because there were so many different play strands around. Going back to the 50s, it being that model. And the 80s is where we start losing that, because they don't want to spend the weekly budget on new sets, on new actors, on new characters every single week. And I think that's a shame, because it does lose a vital part, which you can let writers develop your voice. Unless you get a mini-series, someone like Russell T Davies is allowed to develop on children's TV, but now they develop via soaps and serial dramas. That's how it changes our landscape a little, where it's got so many of these distinctive voices, who write stuff like Pender's Fen, Robin Redbreast, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is something we're missing, because when you're a writer and you've got to write, like, your entry point is going to be 6 hours. That's a much bigger commitment, and it's a lot. Even Russell T Davies, admits, with the Grand, that he kind of came unstuck on that. He wasn't the writer that he became when he did the. Although in a way, he said he benefited from it. He kind of he found his voice almost by accident on the second series. Well, not by accident, but he found his voice in the second season of The Grand.
Almost by crisis management, isn't it? And you go, it's Dennis Potter is the kind of voice you see coming up and developing through plays. Say Emergency Ward 9, I think it was. Traitor. He's developing such a distinctive voice right through. And you get those extraordinary, but you get, Penny Store in Heaven and Singing Detective.
We've quite enjoyed Bright Eyes, I think. We're coming to that conclusion. And
certainly go back to it.
And so, in fact, yes, I think I've appreciated it a bit more talking to you about it. I mean,
it's what these conversations are all about, isn't it, really? Same thing as finding your perspective on it.
Thank you. So, moving away from Bright Eyes for a moment, I'd like to move on and talk a bit about John Arnold and what he's up to these days. So, what are your projects like at the moment?
Mainly on the Strangers in Space podcast. Tend to do a couple of those a week. I know there's one every other weekday. I'm on a fair few of them, so we talk about Doctor Who, films, and old television, anything that we want to talk about, really. And I'm popping up a lot more on the Hamster with the Blunt Penknife strand, particularly their book club strand at the minute as well. So we're covering Doctor Who books right back. We could go right back to the Daleks, right up to date, to Paul Mars's Wonderland book. I'm still finishing off editing a Buffy book for Obverse in the Silver Archive range. At the moment, I think that's about as much as I can cope with on my plate. But those are the current projects.
Sounds brilliant, and I can certainly recommend Strangers in Space. I think it's a great podcasts. I've always enjoyed it. I must listen to more of it. You're so much more prolific than me, you see. That's it's keeping up with it. But
there's always so many more podcasts than time available, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
There are black archives available from authors' books as well still.
Yes, you've written some marvellous black archives as well. I can certainly recommend to people. And I'm sure your Buffy one will be an interesting take. Right. Well, thank you very much, John, for joining me for talking about Bright Eyes. Appreciate your time. And thank you very much for listening at home. I would love you to come back on another time, John.
Oh, very happy to.
Take care, and until next time, this has been Very British Futures. Very British Futures is hosted and produced by Gareth Preston with special guest John Arnold. Music by Chattery Art. If you can take a moment to rate us on your podcast app, that would be much appreciated. You can get in touch with the podcast via verybritishfuturespodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on X, Twitter @FuturesVary, or visit our Facebook page. For more information on Bright Eyes, visit our website at westlakefilms.uk, Very British Futures. This has been a Phantom Frame production.